As promised a few months ago, we're going to be addressing the topic of the Game of Thrones, the Land of Fire and Ice, that doomsday book that we've looked at before, Norfolk, and the relationship between the Norfolk and the entities identified as Hebrews. In order to address these issues, we're going to be expanding on our discussion related to the pole flipping or the flipped earth. Specifically, we're going to be looking at this dynamic of the Earth's magnetic field flipping. Now, there's some confusion because there's some scientific gaslighting going on, and sometimes the conversations relate to the sun's magnetic field flipping. But we are specifically going to be looking at the dynamic of the Earth's magnetic field flipping. And you see here in this BBC article, it says Earth's magnetic field is overdue a flip. Should we be worried? And so what they are talking about apparently with respect to these poles flipping is the North Pole and the South Pole literally switching places. Now, this is deep for a number of reasons, because when you're talking about flipping, another way of understanding flipping is that something is overturned. Something is being reversed. Something is being undone. And so let's put the earth with this discussion. And so it is essentially the earth being overturned, the earth being reversed, the earth being undone. And according to a number of scientists, we are currently in the process of this occurring. And according to some of them, we are overdue for this occurring. Of course, another way of thinking about this symbolically is that with respect to this earth flipping is the possibility of a new paradigm. And so whatever the paradigm is that we've been operating under, that being flipped. And also flipped earth could also indicate a new earth. Another part of the historic and scientific gaslighting appears to relate to this construct of the dark continent. And as you know, the dark continent has historically been identified as Africa. Now, this is very interesting because there's really nothing dark about the continent of Africa except the people. And so the continent itself is not dark, but we've been misled to believe that the continent is the dark continent simply because of the skin color of many of the people in Africa. And so we're going to look at this deception. And we've looked at this dynamic of the name of Africa before. We spent quite a bit of time analyzing the name of Africa. And what we're going to see is that this Africa name and this identification of Africa as the dark continent, this could also apply to America, by the way, this whole dark continent obscurity dynamic. This entire dynamic appears to be a superimposition, or what's also psychologically known as a projection onto another entity. And so in other words, those individuals who really are the manifestation of the dark continent projecting onto a continent or a group of people, what's really inside of them or whatever is the embodiment related to them. And so it might help to go back and look at some of the discussion related to Africa and the origin of the name, how the continent got the name, in order to better understand or continue the conversation that we're having right now. And so, what we see when we are looking at this idea of a dark continent is the idea of something being cloaked, masked, covered, and also the construct of hell. And remember, we looked at all of this before. And all of this, interestingly, is tied to the Norse code, that, of course, is related to the Doomsday Book. Peeling back the layers of these paradigms, what we find is that not only do we have the Norse code, but Norse is actually code for something. And it's something that we have basically overlooked, but it definitely ties into this entire earth flipping paradigm. And also, it ties into this misconstruing of Africa as the dark continent. What we see when we unpack this entire paradigm is Norse is code for hellish. Now, what this requires is a reformulation in terms of our paradigm of the lands of fire and ice. And it's possible that there is a misunderstanding in terms of this fire and ice. And perhaps it's really the land of fire and heis. Kicking off this examination, we're going to look at the construct of North. And of course, Norman, Norse, Nordic, all of this is coming from the foundation of the construct of North. Now, most of us, many of us, have been under the impression that North means something that is up in relation to what we have been told is the equator. And so the idea of North in relation to the equator is about going upward. And so if people are going to the North Pole, they would be going up. If people are going north, they would be going up north, not down north. Apparently, however, many of us have been incorrect, or many of us have just been a part of an extremely high-tech gaslighting dynamic. So we're going to start off with this construct of North, and then we're going to see where it leads us. And so it indicates here in terms of etymology, North, coming from the Old English Nord, northern, lying to the north, northward, to the north, in the north, Nertha, Nord, or Nord. Okay, so far, so good. Now we get into the flip of the paradigm of North. So apparently, North is not about being above. According to the etymology or the history of this word or this construct, North is another way of saying left. Also, another way of saying below, deeper, lower down, from beneath. Okay. Very interestingly, hell. Okay. So when we are looking at these transliterations and these translations coming in and out of various languages, we have this idea of North being something that is in contravention of what we have been historically told North was all about. At no point in time are children generally taught that North is down or North is beneath. or north is hell. In fact, north historically has been related to what's known as heaven or the heavens. Now, what we're going to find out is looking at various sources. There is this paradigm of north being related to that which is below. Now, of course, when the Earth's magnetic poles flip, this would be the case. However, operating under the paradigm that we currently have, north is supposed to be at the top and south is supposed to be at the bottom or below. However, perhaps this paradigm has gotten ahead of the purported science and it is readying us for the paradigm shift or the earth shifting. And so again, here we have this idea of north meaning hell. And when people think about hell, of course, it's supposed to be something that is down below or inside. And so we see some consistency here with this free dictionary, Wiktionary, that indicates north means or comes from this idea of inner or under. And so when you're thinking about the earth, the inner earth or under the earth, again, that's typically where people think of hell as being. And so you see here again, it talks about north being left or below in relation to the orientation of the sun. And then we see yet again that north or nerteros, coming out of the Greek, means infernal or lower. Again, hell. So now let's just take a little journey into scripture and what we see at 6828 Strong's Tzophon. And this is another way of saying north. What's interesting is that apparently even in scripture, north is something other than what we have understood north to be. And so here you see north, this Tzophon, north side, northern, northward. Typically, when individuals would be reading this, they would typically be thinking up. And so what we find when we dig deeper into Strong's Concordance is that dark continent dynamic. And so what we see here is, according to scripture, the understanding of north is hidden and dark. It is something that is hidden, obscured, and something that is dark. Not the people, but the direction. Not the people, but the place, apparently. And so it goes on to indicate that the northern side of something is the dark side and the gloomy side. And it is also a quarter of the earth. Of course, you've heard the four corners of the earth. Okay, so the north corner, the north quarter, is that which is hidden, dark, gloomy, and unknown. Now, common sense dictates that this is not Africa. Common sense dictates that it actually is that North Pole that we've heard about. Because, of course, most of us have never actually seen the North Pole. We assume it exists because we've been told that it exists. However, we don't know firsthand that there is a North Pole or a South Pole. But based upon what we have here, whatever the North is, the North Pole, it's that place that is hidden, dark, gloomy, and it is a section of the earth. And here we see at 6845, again, this idea of to hide. And here it goes on to indicate, among other things, that this whole north dynamic is about that which is concealed, hidden, secret, lurking, a secret place, stealthily watch, and treasures that are stored up. You might also recall that we've addressed this topic before in relation to who? Jacob and Esau. Now, interestingly, Esau is presented as the one who's sort of covered in a mantle and cloaked. However, it's Jacob who put on the little costume and covered himself and hid himself so that he could deceive his father to trick him out of this blessing. Now, of course, you have some people that say that it was a divine deception. If somebody ever tells you something is a divine deception, you're being gaslit. Okay, so continuing on here, it indicates to hide. Again, this is north. To hide, cover something over. Also to hoard. It means to lurk, to hide oneself, to be secret. So a secret place is what this is talking about. A covered place, a hidden place, a secret place. Now, interestingly, this is also part of the description of heaven, and we're going to look at that. This lexicon offers not only the understanding of north, but it also offers the understanding of north in relation to what is known as south. And it also indicates that that which is the north land is also understood as Babylonia. Babylon. Interesting. I don't think I recall that in prior discussions about Babylon. Never really thought about Babylon as being up north. It always seems like it's sort of south. At any rate, we have here this idea of north relating to the north quarter, again, hidden, obscured, dark, and in contrast to the south, that is well lit by the sun. It also indicates here the northern heavens, which is almost the same as for the heaven generally. And so again, we talked about how heaven is related to this construct of something being obscured and something being hidden. And here we see again in this King James concordance that north, again, is about that which is dark, obscured. It's a quarter of the earth. It's gloomy and it's unknown. Again, this primarily fits with the North Pole and not with Africa. It's also noteworthy that the U.S. is referred to as North America. Okay, so what we also see here with respect to this construct of beneath, that it means under, below, the lower place, further down. So this is the same definition as north. So there's a continuation of this bizarre paradigm related to the north. And then you see again that this is related to nether, also meaning unworthy of. Now let's jump into the identity of the Norfolk or the Norman. And so we had the Norman conquest, the Norman invasion, and they were invading everything. In fact, they have invaded everything. And so now when we look at this Norfolk, no, it's not just a place in Virginia. We see that this is a county in East Anglia or England. This is a territory of the northern people. So Norfolk is this combination of north and folk. Now, of course, this is very interesting because we now see that north means something very specific. And so we are talking about or describing, or they are describing, a characteristic of the people who engaged in these invasions and these conquests. Right now, we really don't know where they were coming from, though, because originally it was thought that they came from up and then came down. But now it looks like we're not quite sure based upon these etymologies. Did they come from up or did they come up from down? It's not completely clear. And so, in addition to the Norfolk, we have the Netherlanders, the Netherlands. What are we talking about when we're talking about nether? It continues on. And so you see here nether not being up, but down and downwards, lower, below, beneath, down, below, downward, low, down. And this is coming from a variety of languages. And so there is this consistency going on with respect to this construct of nether. And here we see this consistency yet again, that nether means lower or situated on lower ground, also related to body parts. And then we have the good old netherworld, which means place beneath the earth. Again, suggesting this hellish area. And so again, north world is the place beneath the earth. And here we have a specific deconstruction related to Netherlands, European nation along the North Sea west of Germany, from Dutch Nederland, literally lower land. Again, the Low Countries. And this is in contrast to Dutch Overlander. The other construct related to nether or north or northern is infernal. And so we've talked about the infernal regions before. Infernal meaning the underworld. The ancient place known as Tartarus. There's another place that's very similar. It means the same thing no matter how you slice it, and that's Tartary or Tartaria. All of it, same thing. And so it indicates here pertaining to the underworld, the sunless abode of the dead, or in terms of Christian theology, the place known as hell. Infernal meaning hell or hellish. These lower regions, the lower world, beneath, underground, infra. What's also interesting about this is that it ties to that construct of plutocracy. And so again, plutocracy means the rule of the wealthy or the powerful. And if you recall, Pluto is understood as Infernus Rex. And so the king of the underworld, the king of hell. Now, we also see that there's an association between fire and heat and this concept of hell. Now, remember, the land of the north is known as the land of fire and ice. Now, let me tell you a very interesting story about this little boy. I think he was maybe about 2 or 3 years old at the time. He came from Germany, and he was visiting a family member. And the little boy didn't speak English. He spoke German. While he was visiting, it was during the summer, he had a little sweater on, and he kept complaining the entire time he was with the family member, saying, "Heiß, heiß," and tugging at his sweater. Well, the family member thought this meant that the little boy wanted ice. And so he got all of the ice cream he could have ever dreamed of, all of the popsicles he could have ever dreamed of. However, he kept saying heiß. When one of the parents arrived to pick up the little person, there was a conversation about the little person repeatedly saying heiß, heiß. And the parent shared that in German, the little boy was saying he was hot, not that he wanted ice. And so there's a question about that whole land of fire and ice and whether it is really the land of fire and heiß. And we've looked at this before, where there is an affinity for this construct of HEL or HELL in some Nordic cultural dynamics, some naming dynamics. And so what we see here in the Greek is hell is coming from 1067 Strong's, meaning Gehenna, and it's also of Hebrew origin. And so there's a relationship between the Greek construct and the Hebrew construct, but both of the constructs mean the same thing. What's also interesting is the scripture narratives related to hell. And so you see here up at the top at the Strong's definition that hell is understood as a valley of where? Jerusalem. It is understood as the place or a state of everlasting punishment. This brings us right back to that Doomsday Book and the multiple meanings related to doom and doomsday. And so when looking at Thayer's definition, we see that hell is the place of the future punishment. It's related to fire. It also indicates this was originally in a valley south of Jerusalem, where filth and dead animals of the city were cast out and burned, a fit symbol of the wicked and their future destruction. Very interesting here, because again, This is presenting a very interesting picture that's not the picture that we typically think of when we think about some of these places that we have been talking about throughout time. And so here again, we see in the Oxford Languages, hell meaning to cover or hide, coming out of the Indo-European root. But also make note of this other etymology related to the German and this Holle. This is really cause for pause. And so when we think about the Norman invasions, the Norman conquest, and the manner in which many of the Normans found their way into the Americas. And so, who really conquered America? The Northerners, whatever that is. And so, what we have here is additional etymology related to hell. And we see again, netherworld, infernal regions, a place of torment for the wicked after death, the underworld, the concealed place, to cover, conceal, save. A cave or a cavern. And you see all of these transliterations. So you see it in the Old English, you see it in the Proto-Germanic, Old Saxon, Dutch. And with the Dutch, you see the HEL versus LL, and then the Old Norse, HEL, and then the German HOLLE, and then the Gothic HALJA. And so you see all of these transliterations, but all going right back to this dynamic of north being synonymous with hell. Now, considering all of these paradigm shifts that are going on with respect to this construct of north and nether and hell, we see that there is another way of entertaining this whole idea of Game of Thrones, not just the fictional account, but the real world Game of Thrones that we have been laboring under for who knows how long. And what we see here is that, again, this Old Norse understanding of north, meaning hell, something that is hidden, but also this is related to the name of Loki's daughter in mythology, who ruled over the evil dead in Nephilim. Again, related to the lowest of all worlds. It gets even deeper. This is also related to the construct of Sheol, and we've talked about that before. In the Old Testament, Sheol; in the New Testament, Hades. This is figuratively understood as a state of misery. What's also interesting is that in some theories, this is the place where the patriarchs, prophets, and those similarly situated awaited the atonement. And here you can see the actual direct translation from the English into the Dutch, and you see the HE double toothpick and the HEL. And again, it's understood as hell, inferno, Hades, Tartarus, the pit, the bottomless pit. And so what we have here is north, northern, Norfolk, Netherlands, nether regions, infernal, all being related to, or another way of saying, hell, inferno, Hades, Tartarus, the pit, bottomless pit, not that which is up above. And here you see this Proto-Indo-European root, meaning to cover, conceal, save. And there are some other words that share this root. One, interestingly, being apocalypse. Another one being hall. Another one, Valhalla, again, and interestingly, occult. And here you can see this affinity that we were just discussing related to this word hell, this construct of hell. There are places named hell on earth. Helsinki, Hell, Poland, Hell, Michigan, and Hell, Iceland. Notably, all of these places are colder. And here you specifically see Hell located in Norway. And so with Norway basically translating as Hellway, it's noteworthy that there's a place in Norway also known simply as Hell. Now we're going to revisit that whole dynamic of Africa being understood as this affair, or the covered place, the hidden place that we now see is associated with another location. And so we see here in Scripture, as we looked at a few years ago, a fair coding at 666, interestingly, is the root of this word Africa, a fair. Again, just like hell, just like north, just like Nor or Norse or nether, relates to this idea of covering. And here we see it again. If you recall, there's also another correlation or another meaning, and it is turban. So this idea of being wrapped, enveloped, covered. Now, if you recall, this whole affair, is associated with Abraham, associated with Shem. And so this is a part of a root of a name, of a collective of people, of an individual person and a collective of people in Scripture. And so we see here that affair at the 665 is another way of saying mourning related to grief and sadness, worthlessness, and also hoarfrost. And so if you recall what hoarfrost is all about, you can see now how this would be tied to that which we have previously understood as north. Again, we have this idea for affair as enclosed, cover, mantle, and turban. There's also some indication that there's some conflation between the north and the east. And this is related to what we will also deconstruct, that whole idea of the construct of east and what east is all about. And so we see here very clearly that hoarfrost is about these ice crystals. And so again, this may relate to certain parts of Africa at certain times, but it definitely relates to the Arctic or the North Pole or those northern regions. Now we're going to look at how this ties to Abraham and Shem. The person that shares this name construct is Ephraim. Now, Ephraim is a son of Joseph in the biblical narrative. And Ephraim is one of two brothers. One is Manasseh and the other one's Ephraim. And Ephraim is the younger brother, the lower brother. Okay? But ultimately, based upon the actions of his usurper grandfather, Ephraim also becomes a usurper, because Ephraim is given the portion of the inheritance that actually belongs to Manasseh. So again, we see this dynamic of flipping, reversing, overturning in relation to this individual who is receiving a birthright blessing that does not belong to this individual in the scripture. What's also interesting is how these entities who understand themselves as Brit Israelism and Hebrew Israelites, they have identified this Ephraim entity and the people of Ephraim as, for the Brit Israelism people, Britain is understood as Ephraim, the one with the birthright blessing. And for the Hebrew Israelites, Puerto Rico is understood as Ephraim, the one with the birthright blessing. And what's also interesting about this is that Judah is usually the one that takes the lead, which is another usurper dynamic, because technically Judah is not in the lead. It would be Reuben, but why would we be surprised? Okay, so what we also see here is that Ephraim is associated with the kingdom of what? Northern Israel. This is the North Kingdom. And also a tribe of the East. Again, with this correlation between North and East. And so we also see, interestingly, that Ephraim is associated with this Aphir construct, of course. And so Ephraim is also this idea of that which is below, which of course ties to him being the younger brother. Ephraim is also related to the word Euphrates or Ephrata. And here you can see these two charts that map out where Ephraim and everybody else is supposed to be. And so you can see, with respect to Brit Israelism, Ephraim is Britain up on the top, okay? And then Manasseh, which is America, right under that. And then Reuben, mysteriously, is under those two. And then, of course, you see on the left-hand side, with respect to the Hebrew Israelites, Ephraim is Puerto Rico, followed by the Cubans, Manasseh. Reuben is understood as the Seminole Indians. It's unclear where these people are getting these ideas from, but what's clear is they are definitely identifying with this paradigm of these two kingdoms, and they are identifying themselves as being a part of these particular kingdoms. And so what we also see tied into all of this is that Eber identity. And so that Eber or Eber identity is tied into this entire Norman, Norfolk, Normandy dynamic, the Norman invasion, and ultimately the Norman evasion, because a part of the Norman dynamic is invading and then hiding among the indigenous or the previous people, and thereby evading detection. You saw this, of course, with the Moriscos and the Moranos, and they are definitely tied to the Norman dynamic. And so what we also see here is that this Eber is related to Ebros, Iberia, Aber, Iberia, Iberia, Iveria, based upon Betacism. And also this definition of Aber related to region beyond. Again, we go back to the whole North dynamic and we ask the question, region beyond what? Now, some people will conveniently suggest that this means people of the West or beyond the Western region. That's not exactly what it says, though. It's region beyond, and that actually fits, by the way, with Northern, quite frankly. It also is tied to this idea of not only distance or space, but time. And so this idea of something being past, something being bygone. And as we revisit this construct of Valhalla, which is supposed to be this heavenly hall in which Odin receives the souls of heroes slain in battle, what we see when looking at Valhalla is basically the hall of hell. And so we also see that it has that root that we discussed before, that is to cover, conceal, and save. But we also see that there is a deity associated with Valhalla, and that deity is Odin. What's also interesting about Odin, who is a deity in this narrative, in this paradigm, is that Odin is associated with the word Dan or Din. And Din or Dan is one of the sons of Jacob. What's noteworthy about Dan or Din is that he tends to be left out of a few narratives. If you look at the 12 tribes charts, you will see that Dan is missing. What happened to Dan? Good question. You'll also see a narrative in the book of Revelation where Dan is missing again. Dan or Din means judge, judgment. Remember the Doomsday Book? Doomsday is associated with judgment. Now, what's noteworthy, again, about Dan or Din is that this appears to be the root of a number of Norse or Nordic people. Sweden. Okay. So that's one example. Denmark is another example. You might recall that there was a collective of people at one point on the west coast of Africa known as the Dahomey. Remember that? And there was a discussion about them identifying with someone, a chief known as Dan. And so you see this Dan construct floating in and out of a number of narratives. But very specifically, we have Dan as a deity, essentially, in Odin. And so we see that Dan is associated with the Norse, with the North, which, of course, we know now is associated with that which is down under, that which is beneath, that which is below, that which is infernal, essentially that which is hell. And so again, we have this integration of these entities in scripture with this Norse Norman dynamic. What's also interesting is with respect to those 12 tribes, there are some tribes, the northern tribes, there are those tribes that are considered scattered. For some people, they identify them as lost. But are they really lost? So are the northern tribes actually lost? Or are they just concealed? Consistent with that paradigm flipping of north and south and upper and lower, we have this understanding of heaven as being something inconsistent with what we have traditionally thought about with respect to heaven. Now, before we go into this, I just want to point out that from the Old English, there is this Hefon, which is this word for heaven. This is the root here. This is essentially the name of that little king on the west coast of Africa. His name was Hefon. And what was interesting was it's very difficult to find that name played out in other contexts. It's like a very rare name, a very rare construct. You can't really find it in a lot of places, but here it is. Hefon, meaning the home of God in terms of the Old English. This is the understanding of heaven. It is the visible sky, the firmament. But then when you go down and you look at some of the root, you see that it's also related to a covering, meaning to cover, which is the same thing that we are looking at with respect to north. And of course, historically, we have been told that heaven or the heavens are north. Again, this only really makes sense if the earth is structured in a particular way or the universe is structured in a particular way. And here you see this depiction of the lands of fire and ice, or the lands of fire and heis. And here you can see this expanded look at this construct of hot and heiß. You can see coming out of the English, you have hot going into the German, heiß, meaning hot or heated or burning. As we wrap this up, we're going to quickly look at this whole construct of doomsday and this doomsday book that was created by the Normans as a part of their invasion and evasion. It's very interesting that they would come up with a construct such as a doomsday book, but that's what we have. And so when we look at this doomsday book, what we have essentially is a book of judgment. Doomsday is another way of saying the Armageddon. Doomsday is another way of saying the end of the world. So the Normans, the Norse, the North folk, they have this book because the book still exists, the Little Doomsday and the Big Doomsday book. And so there is actually a book or books that are the Armageddon books, end of the world book, the Last Judgment book, the Day of Reckoning book. And these books, the little one and the big one. The names that are in there are the names that are supposed to exist throughout time. And the land that has been allotted to these various people, it belongs to them and theirs throughout time. Doomsday is also about the law. So we're talking about judgment. It's also about the law. So this is a law book. And a lot of our legal paradigms actually come from the Normans, interestingly. And so that's another odd dynamic that's going on here. We've got the North people, also understood as the Hell people, having this book that was created as a part of their invasion of these other spaces, the taking of things that, of course, didn't belong to them. And they have this book related to the takers, this Doomsday book. Now, what's also interesting is when looking at this construct of doom, a couple of other words come up with respect to translation, and we're going to quickly look at those other words because those words are related to possibly groups of people. One of the first translations related to doom is Gaza. And so when we look at it that way, we have Book of Gaza Day. And as you are aware, this construct of doom is a construct that speaks to death, destruction, a terrible fate, the downfall of something, ruin, disaster, annihilation, the end of something. And what's interesting related to Gaza is this doom also means catastrophe. Continuing on, we have Moira for doom, and this is in the Greek. And here we have Moira in the Greek taking the book of Doomsday to the book of Moira Day, the book of Mara Day, and the book of Moros Day. And finally, we're going to look at a number of places that are understood as Nordic or Norden. There are two lists of similar places related to the North. There is some overlap, but we're going to look at the two lists and then you can see the overlap. And so with respect to the Nordic places or the Norden, we have the space, of course, Northern Europe. Then we also have the North Atlantic. Along with that, we have Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Faroe Islands, Greenland, and Åland. Now we'll go more in depth related to the Germanic tribes when we address the Holy Roman Empire. But what we also see with respect to this North or Nordic dynamic, we have the Germanic tribes. Now the Germanic tribes have a very interesting history, and some of that is manifested in their heraldry, so in their flags. But in terms of places, current places that correspond with the northern spaces, we have Austria, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Sweden. As we close this up, one of the things that we see is that our histories are convoluted. We have been given convoluted histories. We've been co-creating convoluted histories, and it makes it very difficult for us to have anything that can be construed as absolute truth. There is the flipping of paradigms, flipping of scripts, so much gaslighting going on. Even when individuals seek to examine or clarify, individuals are often met with additional gaslighting. We were not here 200 years ago. And so we have no way of having direct evidence of what was going on 200 years ago. We could be told anything. In fact, we are being told just about anything, about everything, which makes it very interesting when people get in an uproar about certain politicians not wanting to teach a certain type of history. Individuals are assuming that the history that would be taught would be the accurate history. In fact, what we've seen throughout time and throughout our discussions, we've seen that history changes. Truth is relative. Truth changes. We often don't have access to truth. What we have is access to facts that seem like truth in the moment until they are reversed by a different narrative. And so therefore it makes it very difficult again for us to get a handle on absolute truth, to get a handle on true north. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care, Susan.